So in the last movie, we talked a lot about different elements of a population that we can measure as ecologists to study how we are affecting the biodiversity of populations on Earth. So that's how we would approach it as scientists. What factors do we look at, and how do we study the effect we're having? And this, understanding more of the effect we're having allows us to intervene and take measures to change our behavior or to change legislation of laws that affect how humans interact with the ecosystem and change how we interact with the ecosystem. So let's briefly talk about human population in these movies. And our population is growing exponentially. So if you remember from the last video, we looked at exponential growth, and that's that J-shaped curve. And we're in our exponential, we're no longer exponential, but we're pretty much in the exponential. Our rate is slowing down, but we're still in the exponential growth phase. No population can grow indefinitely, right? We haven't seen that happen anywhere yet. We're not an exception. So our population increased relatively slowly until about 1650, and then it started growing exponentially. So here's a graph of our population, of human population. 10,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, our numbers were relatively low. We were maybe less than 250 million people. We see that dip around the plague, right? So there was such a significant drop in human viability. So many people died that we can actually see that on the graph. And then around the 60s, we started really demonstrating some strong exponential growth. Our numbers increased very rapidly. And we went from having, a few billion people on Earth to having now somewhere around 6.5 or 7. So we've really increased our numbers very significantly. And it's crazy if you think about it, how many people were on Earth when your parents were alive, right? How many billions? How many people were on Earth when your grandparents were alive? These are people that might be still alive and might remember what it was like on Earth when there was only half or a quarter of the number of people. So ask them what it was like to have a less crowded Earth. Was it nicer? All right, so here's a graph of our human population, just like the graph we saw before, but we're focusing on the last 100 years or 200 years or so. And so our growth is slowing down, but we're still growing quite exponentially, I would say. So what year were your grandparents born? Mine was born around 1925, so there were only about 2 billion people on Earth. So she went from 2 to 7 billion people on Earth. All right, so how many human beings can our biosphere support? I think it's a very interesting question. How many human beings do you think Earth can support? Scientists estimate that it's somewhere around 10 or 15 billion. So if it's on the low end, we're almost there, right? So right now we have about 7, maybe a little bit more. So one more generation, we might be very, very close to our maximum carrying capacity. Do you recall what carrying capacity is? It's that the number of individuals that the system can support, right? That flat part of the logistic curve. And there are a limited number of resources on Earth, of course. So there's going to be a limit. We're going to run out of resources at some point, right? We need food and water and space, land to grow our food, and Earth is finite in size, so and availability of resources, right? We're not getting more water from space. We're not getting more carbon from space. We have to work with the materials that we have on Earth right now. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting question what the carrying capacity of Earth is and what the footprint that we need to survive. Our carrying capacity very obviously is going to be limited by food, space, resources, or just garbage that we accumulate. And not only will we affect ourselves by not thinking about these things in advance, we're going to affect other ecological systems, and those in turn are going to affect us indirectly or directly, right? So if we reduce species diversity, we are going to affect our health and our ability to survive on Earth. So how do we disturb our local ecosystems? Through trawling in the ocean, we're destroying reefs, and these are ecosystems where fish live. So if we disturb fish ecosystems, we're reducing availability of food to us, right? Of course. Fertilizing. So when we put nitrogen into agricultural fields to fertilize them, we're affecting ecosystems. So we're trying to get the biggest, strongest plants to grow with the most nutrients. However, that nitrogen that we fertilize fields with is going to get into, we're just putting pure nitrogen in. It's not going to bind to the soil completely, so a lot of it's going to be washed away. It might wash into the water, and it's going to affect the growth of all sorts of algae and things in the water. So that's going to affect our ecosystem. That usually kills fish when these algal blooms take over. Acid rain, so industrial waste and things like that contribute to water becoming more acidic, rain becoming more acidic. So that kills off elements of the ecosystem, plants and fish. So again, we're just reducing our availability to have food. And if our population continues to grow, almost exponential growth that we've been seeing, we're going to need all the food we can get. So we should probably limit the amount of destruction that we put onto our resources. This is just a map of acid rain. So they're showing you how much acid is in the rain in different measurements that people took all around America. We put a lot of toxins into the environment in different ways. We'll have a whole module about that, but toxins are going to affect a lot of populations of animals and plants, and we eat those things too, so we are putting those toxins back into us. Deforestation is, of course, going to displace a lot of populations, and it's going to affect carbon sequestration and other things that we also require to live on. So these are contributors to CO2 levels. We will have a whole module about this as well. So when we put more CO2 into the atmosphere, this reduces the heat that can escape Earth. So Earth gets a little bit warmer when we put more CO2 into the atmosphere. And we can see that graphically. We can see that the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and the temperature on Earth are correlating very closely. And what happens when you heat Earth up? So obviously we're going to affect a lot of ecosystems that are more fragile, and we've shown a lot of different ways we are affecting the environment and could be affecting different species. And we've also talked about these founder effects and bottleneck effects, and we've talked about that overshoot. So when we saw those moose and they had that exponential growth, they overshot the availability of resources, and then their population dropped so dramatically that they couldn't recover because there just wasn't enough resources, or there wasn't enough food or individuals to reproduce to save that population. So when that happens, we call that an extinction vortex. So, when we talk about species that have very low numbers on Earth, such as white rhinos, at this point there's one breeding pair left or something. So it's impossible to recreate these species. Even if there are two individuals that are perfectly capable of reproducing, it's not really possible to restart another species with only two reproducing individuals. So what happens is when you have a very small population, you enter this extinction vortex. And part of the problem is that the remaining individuals have a complete loss of genetic variability. And if you remember in our original lecture when we talked about biodiversity and natural selection and genetic variability that is required for natural selection, here's where it comes into play again. So the lack of that genetic variation is going to prevent the species from being able to recover. So that genetic variation is necessary to enable the evolutionary responses for the individuals to adapt to a new environment. So let's look at a cartoon of that extinction vortex. So if you have a very small population, there's a lot of inbreeding and a lot of genetic drift, and that might not necessarily be a good thing, right? So genetic drift might introduce a lot of features that are not well adapted to the environment. And the smaller the population gets, the less genetic variability there is. So the individuals are going to be less adapted to their environment. There's going to be a reduction in fitness, lower reproduction, higher mortality, and the population is going to get even smaller. So this is why these very small populations are very difficult to save, because they've just entered a genetic situation where the variability is too low and the number of individuals reproducing is too low to actually be able to have a well-rounded, diverse population that can reproduce and effectively adapt to their environment. So scientists think that we are in the midst of another extinction period. So there have been 5 in the past. The most famous one is, of course, where a meteor hit Earth and killed off all the dinosaurs. That's everyone's favorite extinction. So we're bringing on number 6. Human beings are bringing on the next one. So here they're showing you the number of families on Earth and the extinction rate. So you can see those very high peaks when the extinction rate was very, very high. So what can we do? You can probably spend some time thinking about what you would like to do or what humankind can do, right? So legislation, obviously, to save species that are undergoing rapid declines. Thinking about where you get your food from, I think, would be a good way to actively participate in maintaining the biodiversity on Earth. Using less energy, right? That saves money and reduces the amount of carbon that goes into our atmosphere. So anything that you can do to save money and help the environment is great, right? So use less electricity, use less gas, etc. Just throw away less food, buy less things that you don't really need. I think those are the easy things that most of us can do. So think about it.